This will be the last recording about the Suez Crisis, and we're going to be talking about the consequences of it for all the nations involved, for Arab nationalism, and the continued development of the Cold War. Where we left off with in the last recording were the events of the Suez Crisis itself, which was the stage attack on Egypt led by Israel, Britain, and France. And it was the U.S. and the United Nations which stepped in and prevented the crisis from escalating and stopped the military action that was taking place. So let's look at how this crisis affected everybody who was involved. Starting with Britain and France, you can definitely consider them to be the biggest losers of this whole crisis. It was a very humiliating thing for them because they had to give in to what the U.S. and the UN were telling them to do and to stop their military intervention. Immediately after the crisis was over in November of 1906, saw the resignations of both the British and the French Prime Minister. Anthony Eden had been the British Prime Minister, and because of the credibility of the British being damaged in the eyes of the world, and the fact that he had denied the responsibility in the crisis, forced him to resign in January of 1957. Shortly after that, in May of 1957, Guy Mollet, who had been the French Prime Minister, was also forced to resign. Around the same time as this crisis ended in a humiliating way for the French forces were also losing in Algeria. And so basically, British and French influence in the Middle East lost a considerable amount of weight, and therefore their influence was easily replaced by the two superpowers, the United States and the USSR. We had not backed up British and French and Israeli forces in this crisis because we didn't see it as a means to our end objective, which was to secure our own influence in the Middle East and to prevent Soviet influence from taking over. So this, for Britain and France, they saw directly opposite of what they were trying to do in the first place with this staged attack, which was to get rid of Nasser. Instead, Nasser drew a great political victory out of this whole thing. We'll look at his role and the consequences for him and his country and his position as his perceived leadership of the Arab world in a second. Let's see how the Soviets viewed the crisis. They were definitely happy with the fact that the British and the French looked foolish, because those being two major countries of the Western world, even though we were the leader of it, Britain and France acting in this manner and being humiliated by their own ally, the United States and the United Nations, definitely damaged their credibility, which the Soviets were glad to see, because this is what made their influence in the Middle East become ejected. And even though the United States was still threatening to have influence in the Middle East, at least the Soviets could see that the British and the French were no longer a force to be reckoned with in that area of the world. And therefore, by the Soviets offering their support to Egypt in the crisis and continuing, in an implicit way anyways, to support the Egyptians, they were able to gain the foothold that they wanted in the Middle East in this whole process. So the Soviets were definitely happy with the outcome of the Suez Crisis because of the political position it put their country in. For the United States, this led to some important changes or important developments in how we approach the Cold War. First of all, the Eisenhower Doctrine was issued by Eisenhower, and basically what it did was extend the Truman Doctrine by specifically pointing out that we would assist countries in the Middle East who were trying to fight against communist threats. So really, even though the Suez Crisis had nothing to do with communism per se, we still saw that the Soviets could have had a major opportunity here to spread their influence and to expand communism. So therefore, that's what prompted Eisenhower to make this doctrine. If you look over in the Cold War book on page 76 and 77, you can see an excerpt from the message to Congress in which the Eisenhower Doctrine was created. And that basically spells out his reasoning for what he was wanting to do in the Middle East, and where Eisenhower basically said that we would now be assisting the Middle East specifically. Additionally, the U.S. in this whole crisis had supported the UN and had prompted the UN to pass these resolutions. The UNEF was the United Nations Emergency Force, and that's the peacekeeping force that was sent down into this place where the attacks were taking place in the Sinai Peninsula, and the U.S. definitely supported the presence of these troops there to be the new buffer between Egypt and Israel instead of the Israeli troops themselves. We pressured Israel to withdraw its troops immediately, and even though we still diplomatically supported Israel, because in this crisis you could see it could be taken that we were abandoning Israel as an ally, and that's not the case. We still diplomatically supported them and in their struggle against the Arab world, but we were not about to see our own influence damaged and have the Soviets take over as a major role in the Middle East if the Israelis were threatening that, we would put a stop to it. So we showed that we definitely had leverage in the Middle East and pressuring the British and the French to withdraw their forces and pressuring the Israelis to withdraw their troops. So that showed still how much power we had as a superpower, but also as the leader of the Western world. So it's important to remember that we did not abandon Israel. We still supported them, and that would be important to know as we talk about the Arab-Israeli crisis in the future. The next main one is the 1967 Six-Day War, and we did come to the assistance of the Israelis at that point. And all along, we had offered assistance to the Israelis. We just didn't want to see them damage our opportunity to gain an influence in the Middle East and to contain Soviet communism. Now let's look at how the Suez Crisis affected the Egyptians. You could say that Nasser was the biggest winner of this whole crisis, even though he had military defeats against the Israelis and the British and the French attacks. Because of how the crisis resolved with the U.S. and the UN pressuring the British, the French, and the Israelis to withdraw, Nasser had a political victory. After this Suez crisis was finished, Nasser was at the zenith of his power, and he succeeded in taking the Suez Canal because after the crisis was over, the canal company was never returned to the British and the French. So he had effectively nationalized the canal and taken it away from the British and French and helped to eject Western influence as far as the British and the French were concerned from Egypt and the Arab world. Meanwhile, the Aswan Dam did continue to be built. Even though we had pulled our funding and the British had pulled their funding, the Egyptians were still able to get loans from the World Bank, and eventually we did support and return some of our funding to the construction of the dam. So this would be something that would help to develop Egypt economically, and that's what Nasser's dream was all along. So really, none of the things that Nasser wanted to lose were taken from him. He did retain control of the Suez Canal, and the Aswan Dam did continue. After the crisis was over, Nasser also appointed an Egyptian as governor of Gaza, and that would be a contested territory in the years to come with the Israelis. But you can see how much of a level of power that Nasser had at this point. And we'll talk about his role in the Arab world down here at the bottom, but let's look at Israel for a second. The Israelis didn't gain any territory per se in the Sinai, but they were able to secure some victories from this. They gained access to a couple of important water ports, the Gulf of Aqaba and the Straits of Tiran, which then could be used for free shipping, which was something that the Egyptians had obstructed prior to the Suez crisis. So the Israelis benefited from this in ways that the British and the French could not. And even though they went along with the British and French plans, they were still able to get some things for themselves in the process at the expense of the British and the French. So they didn't lose militarily, and they gained some water ports that they had wanted. Some of these issues of access to these ports would lead to the 1967 war. They were also promised by the UNEF that future Fayadeen raids would be contained and prevented by the presence of these troops, and that helped to secure some stability in that part of the region separating Egypt from Israel, and that also made the Israelis satisfied. Their military accomplishments in the Sinai and the fact that they had victories over the Egyptian forces showed that the military power of Israel was something to be reckoned with and something that would need to be respected in the future. They learned some key military lessons in these battles, short as they may be, but that was some lessons that they were able to put into practice in the 1967 war, which was called the Six-Day War for a reason. In 6 days, Israel was able to secure some huge military victories, despite being hugely outnumbered and having the hate of the Arab world against them. So Israel, even though they had to withdraw their troops and their allies of Britain and France were humiliated, Israel did have some gains from the Suez crisis. And also you could throw in there that the U.S. did not abandon them. They continued to be an ally to Israel in the years to come. Finally, let's look at how the Suez crisis affected Arab nationalism. Nasser, being the first leader to successfully challenge the West, was a huge boost in pride to the Arab people. He was seen as the voice of Arab nationalism, and it just did huge gains for the idea of a pan-Arab movement as a major force in the world, along with the superpowers. Nasser definitely was someone who not only tried to unite the Arab nations, but in a way encouraged the Arab nations to side with neither superpower. We definitely know he was against the West, and even though he had become friendly with the Soviets, Nasser also was seen as a leader of not just the Arab movement, but also an idea called the non-aligned nations, which we'll talk about with the Cold War in the future. And it was just basically the idea that countries didn't have to take a side between East and West. They could remain non-aligned and continue their own interests outside of what the superpowers were doing. In 1958, which was just shortly after the Suez Crisis ended, Egypt entered into an agreement with Syria to create a union called the United Arab Republic, which Israel definitely saw as threatening. But this would be something that would also contribute to the outbreak of the 1967 war, as other Arab nations wanted to enter into these agreements and form this Pan-Arab League that was being created. It's similar to how the Slavic people in the years before World War I tried to stand up to outside forces of Austria-Hungary and so forth, and just the idea of uniting together. So basically, in an overall view, the Suez Crisis had the most damaging effects on Egypt and Israel, the most damaging effects on the British and the French, the best effects for Egypt, Israel, and you could say somewhat neutral effects for the Soviet Union and the United States. And that's basically where the situation ended. So the Arab-Israeli conflict picks up with the 1967 war, which is not that far off from the end of this conflict here. So overall, the Arab-Israeli conflict, it's an ongoing thing, but there's periods of times where there's not a whole lot of outright hostility that breaks out, and there's a relative peace. But there's that undercurrent of hatred against Israel and Israel trying to secure its homeland and its rights to be there.